Welcome, everybody. This is the discussion group for Chapter 1 of the Data Management Body of Knowledge. Just to give a quick introduction. First of all, this is our headquarters for studying. This is our study group on Facebook. If you're not a part of this group, I think it would benefit you to join it. All throughout the month, we are, of course, providing information about the data management topic. Because it's January, we are actually covering data management and data ethics in the study group. You'll see lots of people interacting, lots of questions. And then I'm also trying to post pretty much every day information from Chapter 1 right now. One thing that's really important to acknowledge about preparing for the CDMP fundamentals exam is that it's very unequally weighted between the 14 chapters of the book, which are tested on the exam. As you can see, Chapter 1 is only 2% of the exam. But we're still going to treat every chapter equally in the discussion groups that we're having this year. Regardless of the weighting of the chapter, we're still going to have an honest conversation about the content and try to address any questions that you guys have. Just wanted to get that out of the way first. Even though this is a less heavily weighted chapter relative to some others, I still think it's great to very thoroughly read and understand this one in particular because it's basically a table of contents or an index, or it just provides excellent introductory information about this content. And research shows if you have a good understanding of a topic at a high level, that actually really benefits you versus going in cold. The purpose of this chapter is to get you warmed up for reading the rest of the DMBOK. I think that's probably a pretty good framing of it because it definitely handles a couple of useful frameworks and discusses the history of the data management discipline. That's how I would think about this chapter. Let me just pause and see if there are any burning questions from this group before I continue.
Nicole, thank you. I have a question for you. What is, in your opinion, the most important part of this chapter? Because I think that the final part described different data management framework is sort of not so useful for DLSM, in my opinion. One last thing, I didn't find the description that data lifecycle is. It's only described, but it seems too superficial for me. I think that it's a concept, and I don't know if it's described more in deep in other parts of the DMBOK.
Yeah, it is actually. So that's an interesting point. Okay, just to summarize your question, my understanding is that you're asking what is the most important part of this chapter? And also, what is the appropriate way to think about the data lifecycle and the relative importance of that content for the exam? So it's hard to say what the most important part is. As I said a minute ago, Chapter 1 is 2% of the exam. So the exam is 100 questions, easy math. On average, you'll expect to see 2 questions about this chapter. Your mileage may vary. You may get an outlier version of the test, which has many more questions about this chapter, or 0 questions. On average, you can expect to see 2%. This chapter is very wide-ranging. It's basically like a philosophical overview of data and data management. I think maybe the most important part is the frameworks. It's probably easier to write a question asking about a framework than it is to write a question asking about kind of the philosophy of thinking about what is data. That's section 3, which in the physical book is on page 33. So I would make sure that you're at least somewhat familiar with each of the frameworks. These would be very easy to look up on the open book exam. I put a sticky note for this framework section because I thought maybe I would get questions about it, and I didn't want to have to memorize all this information. I just wanted to be able to look it up. This chapter also talks about my favorite framework. You'll hear me talk about this a lot if you end up taking our course, but the Aiken pyramid. I'll show you our simplified version of it. I'm just really fond of this model of thinking about the various domains of data management because it shows data governance as the underlying substrate on which all the rest of data strategy is based. So you need to have this foundation of data governance before you can proceed up the pyramid. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but for data management. So anyway, they talk about that in section 3.4. That's my personal favorite diagram. And then it talks about a couple of other ways to think about modeling data management at a high level. Then the other thing that Gaetano asked about is the data lifecycle, which is section 2.5.9 on page 28. And it has this really simple diagram, which looks like this. It's like a loop, starting with planning and then going through design and enable, create and obtain, store and maintain, use, enhance. And at some point, we also have dispose of, which is very important as well. This is really simple, but I think this is pretty comprehensive in terms of all the things you can do with data. And another thing to note here is this diagram is revisited in chapter 6, the data storage and operations chapter. Data management doesn't go into a ton of detail about what is actually entailed at each of these stages. Data storage and operations chapter, as you would imagine, is very focused on this store and maintain bucket. It does provide you with a bit more of a sense of what actual activities are associated with this life cycle phase. That is just to say the purpose of this chapter is to get us warmed up, starting to think about these concepts, starting to think about data in a structured way, thinking about data as an asset that needs to be managed in order to provide value. And then throughout the remaining 13 chapters, we're really going to dive into these various life cycle stages and start to think about how to execute them successfully.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you for starting us off with that.
I have a similar question
Okay.
regarding. My challenge is also with the frameworks, and I come from an engineering background where I try to map concepts to how it might be implemented technically. And the biggest challenge is especially with the strategic alignment model and the Amsterdam information. These concepts, how do they apply in real life, for example, when it comes to managing data, or are they widely used?
Yeah, it depends on your organization. And I will also add, this is outside of the context of studying for the fundamentals exam, but there's other organizations that are kind of similar to DAMA, and they have their own ideas of what constitutes a data management framework as well. There's another organization called Enterprise Data Management Council. Hudson, have you ever heard of them before?
Yes. I've heard
Okay,
about
so
that.
they have a parallel focus relative to DAMA. They have their own certification called DICAM. And the EDM Council folks, they're based in the finance industry, so they may have more of a industry perspective on data management compliance. So I would definitely look at their frameworks as well if you're looking to get a more holistic view of data and how it's managed. The other thing that I would think about here is with these frameworks, it's important to look at the year that the framework came out. The technology that we have available to us has changed a lot since the 1990s when these frameworks were initially introduced. And so they may emphasize different things relative to how the conversation is going now. For that purpose, I would recommend joining our LinkedIn group where we're talking about modern data management and the challenges of dealing with AI and cloud and these other things. That's my second recommendation, other than looking for additional frameworks. I just want to reiterate the CDMP fundamentals exam is fundamentally a reading test. So all you need to do is read this book. I know it's easier said than done, but read the book and then answer questions about the book. The specialist exams, if you decide to progress, they're a little bit different where there's this imperative to have external knowledge. They'll ask you questions about the topic, and that information may not be contained in the book. But for our purposes, we're getting ready for fundamentals, the first 14 chapters in the DMBOK.
Nicole, can I comment here?
Hello,
Smart.
yes.
Maybe one thing also to mention for both Gaetano and Hudson is that one way to gauge how much you understood the chapter, because a little bit what you were focusing of how much you need to understand about the chapter, is really going through the practice exams. Your question sets either coming from the DAMA purchase itself. When you purchase the exam, you get a number of questions for practicing. Those questions will basically simulate how the test would be, right? So you would see what questions are focused for chapter 1, right? Is it more on the framework? Is it more on the principles, the challenges? Is it the differentiation between data and information? You get the feel of how in-depth the exam will be in that particular chapter. So that will be a good indicator of how much you understood it. And to your question also, Hudson, is that it will also get you a feel of how the questions are formulated for the exam, because it will not go in depth of how to apply it in that per se, because I got your question of how you want to apply it in your workplace and so forth. But as Nicole mentioned, the CDMP is very straightforward memorization. So basically, that's just sort of a point there. Practice exams will be definitely useful as an indicator of how you understood the chapter.
In terms of adopting these frameworks to your organization, that's something that at Data Strategy Professionals, we're really interested in. I would say, Hudson, if you are coming at this from a perspective of like, how do I communicate data management to my people in my business? You might just build your own framework and connect what you're learning to what's important to your organization's business strategy.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks for
Nicole,
your
this
question.
is a great point, how to communicate about data in our organization. I think that the principle we found in this chapter should be great pillars to base a communication strategy. And I think that it's very important to establish a solid strategy in our organization. To return to the question was done, depends on the culture of our companies and the workers and the works about data. I think that it's very important to know very well the principle illustrated here and try to how to apply them in the different contexts.
You raise an interesting point about communicating data to your organization. This is sort of a little bit facetious, but also my recommendation here would be don't communicate about data to your organization's leadership. Our purpose as data professionals is to enable the business strategy by providing support from data. And if you can communicate to your organization about business outcomes, that's going to be a lot more successful than talking about like, oh, we have data quality problems, or like we're lacking a data catalog, or whatever kinds of data related issues, or all of this stuff that we're dealing with as we're working through the book. It's hard because the best way to be successful in your job is to make the data take a back seat, at least in terms of communication, to de-emphasize the data related words and talk about everything in terms of business outcomes. I'm not the first person to have this insight. I was just listening to the CDO of Microsoft, at least their Americas practice, and that was his advice. He was basically saying it's so important to communicate in terms of the language of the business and data as an enablement for business outcomes. Just something to keep in mind. It can be easy to get caught up in thinking about data because it's what we're dealing with, it's what we're studying. But data is a means to an end. It's a means to insight and achieving success, whatever the mission statement is of your organization. What other questions or comments do you guys have?
Hello. First, thank you so much, Nicole, for the great efforts you do.
Thanks.
My question is how to organize the reading. I know reading like a 600-page book would be a little bit hard. Not hard in terms of really hard, but it's like not that enjoyable. So how do you organize this, or how you make it like a fun way to study?
But one thing that Nicole started off at the beginning is that not all chapters are equally distributed. It's not like 10% for each chapter all throughout. It's 100 questions, and there are some chapters that are very heavy, data governance, data quality, and so forth. I'd focus more on the chapters that are heavily focused, that have 10%, 11% of the question. That means 10 questions in the entire exam that are focused on it, or 11 questions that are focused, right? And those are the core chapters that you really need to understand, because that will give you, as logic follows, it will give you a wider range. If you get that chapter fully correct, if you get the main chapters, that's one way to do it. And then one thing to also always remember, which I didn't maybe really figured out until I read through the book the first time, is that the chapters are more or less or somewhat independent from each other. There are some chapters that you can read on its own. Don't think about it as a linear thing that you have to read chapter 1 before you get to chapter 11. It's not necessary. There are some chapters that are very heavily related. For example, architecture and modeling is in there, and then data governance and data quality. Those are very close topics. I would say generally, most of the chapters are very independent. Focus on the chapters that are more important for the exam. Or another strategy would also be focus on where you are the weakest as well. Coming in to the exam, I was not so well versed in data governance or data quality. I was more in the architecture modeling space. So I focused more on that. And one way, again, to indicate that is if you want, go through the question sets. It will give you a guide. You could really see a little bit on which chapters are you a little bit behind and which chapters you are weak on. And then focus on filling the gap of those weaknesses by focusing and reading more in depth in the chapters where you are weak. Because there might be chapters that maybe out of experience and out of reading other resources and so forth, maybe you get the concepts already really quick and you're strong in those. So find out where you are weak and then focus on that.
I was just going to add that 70% of the questions are about the 7 chapters that are listed as options for the CDMP specialist exams. So on our website, we have this article, which is called Best Certification for Data Strategists. And if you scroll down here, eventually you'll find this section where we list all the chapters. We tried to prioritize them in terms of the number of questions on the exam. This is an average that's provided by DAMA. And then if you look at the specialist exam article, then you can see the 7 options that are here. And just these 7 options is 70% of the test. So half of the chapters, 70% of the questions. So you can really do a Pareto principle where you just study really hard these chapters and just review or skim the others. But again, our purpose with these discussion groups, we want to really make sure you guys are prepared with all the knowledge from all the chapters.
I wanted to ask, so far you mentioned three things: data frameworks, Aiken framework, and data lifecycle. Is there anything else that you think are the top highlights from chapter 1?
Again, they could test you about anything in this chapter. It's not for me to say what you should and shouldn't study here. It also just provides an introduction to thinking philosophically about the nature of data. It talks about data evaluation, which is a topic that's really close to my heart. I'll be speaking on this topic at EDW in March, if anybody's going to that. Be addressing data evaluation methodologies in a talk there. It also talks about the importance of data quality, which of course remains really important as we continue to use data in our businesses every day. In the era of AI, data quality is still important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I saw even the practice exams that you have put together, and all the questions are mixed up. So I have to really tease out the questions from each chapter if I'm revising chapter by chapter.
Yeah, you raise a good point. We mixed up the questions in our question sets because we wanted to make it more difficult for you guys. It's called mixed practice or interleaving, and it will enhance your understanding of the content that you're being tested on. However, on the fundamentals exam, you will see 2 or 3 questions on data management. Then you'll see 2 or 3 questions on data ethics. Then you'll see 10 to 12 questions on data governance, and so on, proceeding chronologically through the book until you reach 100 questions. We chose not to do that when we made our question sets because we wanted to challenge you a little bit more. But we still tried to keep the ratios about the same. So we tried to stay with the ratios that are provided by DAMA.
Hey, Nicole, just a quick question, clarification. You mentioned
the
test follows the chronological order of the chapters in.
That's exactly right. So it makes it really easy as you're going through. You can definitely tell which chapter you're in.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for your question.
I can see that the CDMP is not about the technical tools or the technical part, so it's more about the concepts and so on. I'm wondering what possibly would be the most important outcomes someone would think about to get when reading this book or reading about data management in general.
That's a great question. The book is vendor agnostic and it's really tool agnostic as well. I would really focus on the frameworks. I think that's the coolest part of the DMBOK. This is jumping ahead significantly, but in the data quality chapter, it presents a number of different frameworks for thinking about data quality and also just methodologies for developing data quality scorecards and kind of a data quality remediations team. Like, what should they be looking at? What should their processes be in order to fix issues in a way that's going to accelerate the development of business outcomes? That kind of information about how to run your team, how to deal with people, how to manage change related to data, that's evergreen content. And it's not going to change if the year is 2017, 2027, or 2127. Unless we're all replaced by robots in that year, we'll still be dealing with the same kind of people management challenges, and the same frameworks for thinking about data will still apply. I encourage you to join the LinkedIn group. I also posted in the chat one of my favorite podcasts, CDO Matters, and Malcolm Hawker. He's a former Gartner analyst, so I feel like he really knows what he's talking about. And then another person I really like is Joe Reese. He's a former data scientist, and he now mostly works in data engineering and data modeling. But this is really good extracurricular reading. I would recommend those 2 guys for like modern data practices. Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would say that the book is definitely not technical. And there are a lot of concepts and frameworks that you can take away. The knowledge that DMBOK and also the certification provides, it gives you an understanding of things like data governance, data architecture, data quality, as Nicole indicated, because it gives you a wealth of knowledge that you can bring to your organization, even though you're in the data analytics space. In case data governance becomes a huge project or a huge program, even in your company, it helps you be able to speak that language and understand it because you have the background and the frameworks from them and from DAMA and from CDMP. Once it gives you a broad range, it breaks you away from your niche and makes you knowledgeable in a broad range of data concepts.
Nice.
Thank you for highlighting that.
I want to share personal difficulties I encounter when I try to apply this concept in my company. I am the data governance officer in my company, and we are trying to establish a data governance strategy. In our company, there is a lot of legacy software, a lot of oldest database, data source that actually are managed only by IT and operational point of view. we are trying to establish a modern data governance and data management strategy. The difficulties I'm facing is that we are trying to adopt the data management framework that sometimes is too philosophical. It's not deeply connected to the practical exigence of the companies in general. Now I understand that to face the CDMP exam, I have to put myself on the philosophical side, and then in another moment, I'll try to connect them to the practical exigence of my specific company.
Yeah, I think you're right. Peter Aiken, who developed the Aiken framework and is currently the president of DAMA, he likes to say that there is a 1-to-4 ratio in terms of the cost of technology versus the cost of people processes related to the implementation of that technology. I think the DMBOK really helps you to understand the people and the processes component, which is so important.
Maybe the thing that I would say, coming from having tried to do what you trying to do, I had to try doing it for like 4 times in 4 different companies. One way I can tell you is that maybe not, I wouldn't go away from using the term philosophical. I would say maybe a bit theoretical. But there is always company culture and company politics and everything that will play into it, because there is no straightforward way to apply this concept. These concepts will help you have the foundational pillars to have this discussion with management. But I've seen it done the right way, and that right way, I tried to apply it in a different company, and it didn't work. It's not straightforward that you say that do these 3 steps and these 10 steps, and then you'll get a proper data management. There's a lot of things that will go into it, and I would say these are the concepts that you bring along, but you have to adapt. And you have to also be considerate of the company culture and the company dynamics that play into it. That will really matter also on how well it's received.
One other thing about this chapter I want to highlight, on page 37 of the physical book, there's a generic context diagram. There is one of these for every chapter. It is at the beginning of the chapter, like one of the first couple of pages. And this is a good study tool. And it's also a good resource to have handy as you go to take the test, because it goes from inputs to activities to deliverables, and also looking at some other aspects that are supporting the particular knowledge area that's being discussed in the chapter, like the suppliers and the technical drivers. Again, it's really valuable to increase your familiarity with the topic before you jump in cold and try to start learning about it. Getting a high-level overview, reading the table of contents, reading the subject headers. This is actually a good study skill that will increase your ability to intake information as you're reading through the chapter. If you get yourself warmed up by really looking over the context diagram and the topic headers within the chapter before you start reading. That concept is introduced on page 37. And then another thing to note, every chapter is basically organized in the same way, which is explained on page 45. The first topic being the introduction, and then business drivers, goals and principles, and essential concepts. And then the second section is activities. Third section is tools. Fourth section is techniques. Fifth section, implementation guidelines. Sixth says relation to data governance. And then seventh, metrics. This is more of like a guideline than something that they strictly follow in every chapter, but I think it is worth acknowledging that all the chapters pretty much follow a familiar structure. So you can look forward to that as you're reading further in the book. And then also, in my experience personally, the more important content tends to be towards the front of the chapter. A lot of good stuff is lumped into essential concepts topic. I definitely saw fewer questions about tools and metrics and the stuff that falls towards the end of the chapter.
My question is basically, I've been reading the first chapter, but I found that the Dhamma Wheel Evolved was a bit more confusing compared to the earlier Dhamma Wheel.
This one,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yes, it's a bit more confusing. What's your thought on the evolved Dhamma Wheel? I'm based in Kenya, and this is actually the discussions that we actually have in our current chapter. There's a lot of confusion when it comes to the evolved version of the Dhamma Wheel. What's your thought on that?
Like your local chapter when you guys are discussing?
Yes, it is.
Okay, cool. I would be super curious to hear the thoughts of your group on it. I mean, again, my favorite diagram personally is the Aiken framework. Let's talk about the Dhamma wheel for a second. That's here. It's the top one, and it's super simplistic. When they did the DMBOK version 1, they produced this guy. It basically doesn't really give you a ton of value. It just tells you like data governance is central, and then there's all of these other factors related to data, like data architecture, metadata, data quality, whatever. And in the original wheel, as you can see, they all have equal importance. Like all the shapes around the center data governance are of the same size, which seems to imply they're all supporting characteristics related to data management. Data governance is important. All the other topics are relatively of equal importance. I mean, that's why they structure the CDMP exam with the different percentages across the chapters, right? I think that's what they're trying to represent in the wheel evolved here. It has foundational activities at the bottom, and then it has the planning at the top. And then you go down from there into use and enhance and enable and maintain. This is why I like the Aiken framework. It's because to me, that is a sensical ordering of the chapters in terms of their priority.
I think it's a bit more structured. The Aiken pyramid.
I would agree.
Yeah. Because this is very confusing. Even when you are actually trying to deploy the evolved wheel in your organization, the main thing that you're actually looking at is the three main areas, which is the foundational activities, the lifecycle management, and then over and above that is the data governance. Yeah. I think I've got my answer, especially when it comes to the implementation in my organization, I think.
Yeah, again, I really think in terms of when you go about communicating to your own organization, I would say just like get in PowerPoint and make your own framework that connects what you're dealing with to your organization's specific mission statement. That's something I talk about in this book. When they talk about this in the data governance chapter, that you should be using the language of your organization to talk about data. One example of this that I really love is I'm sorry, I know we're jumping across chapters here because we're talking about data governance charters, but you can see a kind of cool example of this. The US Department of Defense published their data strategy. I don't remember if there are frameworks. Oh, well, yeah, there's one. So they built their own frameworks, right? That's kind of cool to see what their thinking was. This is more similar to the original Dhamma wheel. The language that they use when they're talking about data, it's very much based in the mission of the organization. So it talks about how it is the responsibility of all DoD leaders to treat data as a weapon system and manage and secure and use data for operational effect. Hopefully in your business, you're not thinking about data as a weapon system, but it is kind of a weapon against your competitors. Whatever your business's mission is, that language should flow back into how you're thinking about frameworks and documentation, because really what you're doing is you're trying to convince the rest of the organization to care about your work.
And Hudson, I was about to make a similar comment to your question earlier. How do you want to adapt it in the manufacturing space? Find the framework, and I love that statement from Nicole. You try to make it relatable to the business, right? So find the framework that you use in manufacturing, because when they produce the product, when they produce a machine, they must have a certain level of who takes care of quality, who takes care of the issues, and so forth. Just bring that same concept about the manufacturing that product. Now we bring that same concept to data, right? It's the same framework we're applying, now reapplying that from a product to data. And now we also need data quality. Now we need data management, because that product cannot manage on its own, right? There are certain organizations in the company that take care of it. In the same way, that organization also needs to be applied for data. So you can make that relatable depending on your business.
Okay, good.
Thank you. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our hour. Now it's the time to start wrapping up and getting ready for the rest of your day. Thank you guys so much for joining the first of our discussion groups.
Sure.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.